Yeah, so who's ready to talk about your money? Thanks, Doug, for setting that up. Yeah, so if you got the insert, if you got the email, you know that the title of the sermon is Should I Tithe? So we're going to be talking about tithing this morning. As I was preparing for this message, I read an account of a missionary who was ministering to some rural village, and he decided he would teach the small congregation there tithing. And the next day, he heard a knock at his door, and there was one of the men from the village. And he had a fishing pole in one hand, and he had a fish in the other hand. And he said, "I have brought my tithe." And so then the missionary wondered, well, where are the other 9 fish? To which he responded, "Oh, they're still in the river. I just wanted to be sure God got his fish first." And I swear, if there's nothing else you learned this morning except for that, would we be those who say, I just want to be sure God gets his fish first? Hope none of y'all brought fish this morning, but there is something that we can give. And talking about giving these days, many of us are probably skeptics. There's widespread cynicism. There's suspicion about what people will do with our money, especially if you watch the news and you're seeing, the Department of Government Efficiency, and they're defunding all the alleged flagrant spending on all the questionable things. And we're thinking, people are going to do terrible things with my money. And we may superimpose that on the church. We hear stories of churches mismanaging money. And we think, man, do I really want to trust anybody else with this money? It's a good question. Because we're spending, 5 weeks, this is our second week, talking about generosity and regular giving. And I just want you to know that here at Centerpoint, we are an open book. Right? We don't hide how we spend money. You can see the accounting. We will show you where money goes and what it's being spent on. And so we consider it a very high responsibility to earn your trust in that way. Okay, so when I'm talking about tithing, I want you to also see the other side is that you must expect your leadership to be very godly, good stewards of what you give. So we're talking about a tithe. What is the tithe? First of all, let me just make sure you know what it's not, especially based on what I just said. Your tithe is not your due to the Centerpoint Christian Club. It's not like a Y membership. It's not something you pay, and if you don't pay, you're not going to get any of the benefits of being a part of Centerpoint. It's nothing like that at all. It's not some clever scheme that's been concocted by the modern church to just sort of con you or guilt you or pressure you into giving money. It's none of those things. And it is certainly not a means by which you might leverage God to gain some more acceptance or to be loved by him more or to perhaps get that thing that you're just hoping he'll come through on. Okay, it's none of those things. That gets it all backwards and wrong. We're talking about the tithe today because it is a word that appears in the Bible. Tithe is simply tenth. Okay, it's just an English word that means tenth, and it's giving back to God a portion of what we have received, particularly if we use the word tithe, 10%. So it's just a standard of giving. But what I want us to learn today, that it's a means by which, a standard by which the Bible has taught in various places that we put God first. It's a way that we align our hearts and our giving towards God, towards his purpose, what he wants to accomplish. But the big question today is, should I tithe? Does that apply to me? So what I want to do this morning is trace the tithe through the Old Testament. I want to search for the tithe in the New Testament. Is it there? And then I want to ask, what should I do? So, tracing the tithe through the Old Testament. You can go back all the way to the beginning of the Bible, and you're going to find in Genesis 4, just 3 verses after Adam and Eve have been expelled from the garden. That's how early. You're going to find Abel giving to God in worship. Was it a tithe? Tithe is not mentioned there. But I want you to see that as far back as that, as far as back as the first verses that we see coming out of the garden, we see the importance of giving to God in worship. Now, tithing doesn't appear till a little bit later. We find that in Genesis 14. We find this first mention of the tithe. And I want us to see in the Old Testament that there's a voluntary submission of the tithe before the law. There's the requirement of the law as a tithe, but then we want to see what the prophets say about it as well. So we're going back before the law now. And we see that the tithe was this voluntary act of submission. We know that because Abram, in Genesis 14, has just defeated the armies that had captured his nephew Lot. He has rescued him, and on his way back home, he encounters King Melchizedek, who is called priest of the God Most High. So we have this priest king that Abram has now met, and Abram has all the spoils of war with him. And here's what they do. They sit down over bread and wine, and Melchizedek, the priest king, says, he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So Melchizedek is this prefigure of Christ in the Old Testament, the righteous king, the priest king. He blesses Abram, who has just gained all these spoils of war, and Abram's response to him is to give a tenth of all of it. Why does Abram tithe? We don't know of any law that dictated he should do that he should give 10%. This is way before the law. But we know from the words of Melchizedek to him, what Abram's doing is he's recognizing God as the ultimate provider. Saying, I must worship God in this moment. God the creator who has given me all things. God the defender who just gave me victory and saved me. I want to give to him. And so he gives through King Melchizedek. This predates the law by 430 years. And it's a tradition that Abram obviously passes on to his children. There's no mention of Isaac doing it, but there is one of Jacob doing it. In Genesis 28:22, when God comes to him and renews the whole covenant that he had made to Abram, Jacob responds and says, I give you 10%. So we see that there was this wise tradition that was passed on through the patriarchs, that it is good to give to God, and specifically to give this 10%. No law, just wisdom, tradition from the patriarchs. But if you go further, you find it's not a voluntary act of submission when we find Moses. So we go further. Now the tithe becomes a requirement by law. 430 years after that tradition established by Abram, handed down through his children, Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt. God is making them into a nation. And so he gives this nation laws to govern them. And among those laws is the tithe. Leviticus 27, verses 30 through 32. Every tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. And every tithe of herds and flocks, every 10th animal of all that pass under the herdsman's staff, shall be holy to the Lord. Now it becomes a little more complicated. What just seemed this simple act of worship, voluntary submission, now gets laws written all about it and ways it should be done. As a matter of fact, if you say, look, I'd really rather not give up all that livestock, now there's a provision in the law that if you have the money, you can buy it back. There's just a 20% charge if you pick that up. Another fifth. It gets quite complicated here. It's hard to even follow. If you're trying to do this by the law, it gets a little complicated. How much do I really give? What is binding here? I found that whole thing of redeeming it back, like I don't want to give you my cows, I'll buy them back. It's kind of like some of you are probably, Pastor Mac was telling me about the sports group he's involved for his son, where you can either volunteer to sell Snickers at the concession stand, or you can pay up like $200 for the year and not have to do it. So apparently there was provisions just like that in the law. Kind of complicated. But under this law that was given to a nation, we see there was reasons for it. It was important. There was purposes for it. The practical purposes of the law were to support the ministry. There was a tithe for the ministry that took place among them. It was to have a celebration. There was a tithe so that they could all celebrate together, and there's one for distribution so that those that were in need could receive. So a tithe for ministry, Numbers 18:21. To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service that they do. So the Levites are those that are at the tabernacle, at the temple later, taking care of things. And they needed to have income because they had no other inheritance. This was their service in the tent of meeting. So this is a tithe to support the ministry that is taking place at the tabernacle or at the temple. Or today, it could translate into the church, as you hear in 1 Corinthians 9:14, where Paul says those in gospel ministry must be provided for. That's the idea here. It takes funds to support this kind of ministry. So there was a law to make sure that the tabernacle, the temple, had those funds. That was a purpose. Second purpose was for celebration. Listen to this. Deuteronomy 14:23. You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year, and before the Lord your God, in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe. So it's talking about these guys coming together with grain and fruit and meat and wine and oil, and it's a celebration. You're going to eat it there. You're going to celebrate the fact that God has provided for you. All right, so this is like, potluck on steroids, right? This is celebration time. It's a Jehovah Jireh party. So that's one purpose of the tithe, support the ministry. The next was for celebration. And now there's also for distribution. Deuteronomy 14:28-29. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your towns shall come and eat and be filled. So this is saying you need a storehouse of these things because there are people who need it. And you're going to be able to bless them by distributing these funds, these things that you've brought together. And we do that regularly here. We support missionaries. We support people in need within our own community here. So there's a tithe for distribution, for celebration, for ministry. It was essential for the nation of Israel. If they were going to function well, they needed to do these things. To accomplish the very purposes that God had given them, they needed this to happen. But more important than all of those details, all the minutiae of the law, all the specifics of the law, is the purpose of these laws. We can get so caught up in trying to understand all the details and lose sight of the whole intent and the whole purpose for which they were made. Moses tells us why. He says, here's why you do this. This is 40 years after receiving the law. They've wandered in the wilderness. Now they're on the border. They're about to go from desert to promised land. They're about to go from depending on manna day by day to an abundance in this land. And Deuteronomy is Moses reminding them all, hey, remember what we were given. Remember what we've learned. We're about to enter into a place of abundance. Keep this in mind. The law, the tithe. And then he says why? Deuteronomy 14:23. That you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. This is the purpose. Or as the Living Bible puts it, that you may learn always to put God first in your life, that you would be like the man at the door of the missionary saying, I've got the first fish I caught. I give to God first. I know there's more in the river. I can get those, but here is God's first. So in the Old Testament, we've seen the tithe was, in the time of the patriarchs, this voluntary submission. Then it became a requirement by law. And then Malachi tells us another reason. So we move to the prophets. He says the tithe is actually your declaration of trust. This is 1,000 years after the law was given at Sinai. The Old Testament is coming to a close, and the prophet here emphasizes this, Malachi 3:10. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts. If I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. What is he emphasizing? Not all the specifics and details of the law and say, you better do this. He's saying, would you just put God to the test? Would you see this as a declaration of trust? I trust you, Lord. God calls his people to trust him. Will you trust me? Will you give generously and trust me in all of this? We had to learn to trust the Lord. If you remember, several weeks ago, I'd mentioned that our Kia Sportage, like the engine just was making terrible, terrible racket. We drove it to the mechanic. He said, it's done. It's gone. And so we started looking for another car, and like the price tags, we were like, oh my goodness. You know, we haven't saved up enough to do this. And a few days later, the mechanic called back, and he said, I'm just going to take it apart and look at it some more. And he did, and it turned out that it was the timing chain and several other things had broken in there. And then he said, you know what? I think we can fix this. We put him to the test. Let me connect those two. Put him to the test is simply trusting God. And he says, when we trust him, the floodgates will open. Now, floodgates opening, to me, would have probably looked different. I would imagine God's going to give me 25 grand or 30 grand. I'm going to go get a new car. It's not what happened. It's not what happened at all. We paid $2,000, got the engine fixed, but that was way better than having to pour out all that other money. And we said, thank you, Lord. Thank you. We are trusting you. We're going to give to you. And if it's the same old car, that's fine. That's fine. The floodgates of blessing are open because God provides. Provides, providere, or provideo. It means to see beforehand. God provides. It means he sees beforehand so he can act accordingly. He knows exactly what's going to happen, and he will act accordingly. This would be like having a video of the Super Bowl beforehand. And like if the coach had that video, he could act accordingly. He said, we know exactly what's going to happen. I know all of you think the Chiefs have that. I get it. But that's what you could say, look, this is what's going to happen, and we can do this. That's what God does all the time. I know exactly what's going to happen. I'm already there. I provide. Will we trust him? And God also in this passage in Malachi is not only just calling us to trust him, he's calling us to partner with him. He says, bring it into the storehouse. Bring it into the temple bank account so we can fund all this ministry, so you can partner with me in this ministry. Now, I want you to understand something about this passage in Malachi. When he's saying bring it in and he's accusing people of robbing God and not bringing it in, you need to understand that he's speaking directly to the priests. He's saying to the priests, you guys are robbing God. It's not that people weren't bringing the tithe. It's that the priests were misappropriating it. They were not being good stewards. This is what I said earlier. We have to earn your trust. If I'm going to ask you to trust God this morning, I realize I'm asking you to trust me and the leadership of this church. Okay? Your giving requires a trusting relationship with God and with us, and we are committed to make sure that we earn that trust with you. So what do we learn? From the patriarchs to the prophets so far in the Old Testament, we have seen this wisdom passed on, the wisdom of putting God first in all things. We saw it in the patriarchs as Abram recognizes God as the source of all blessing, and he puts God first. That's wisdom. We see it in the law of Moses, where we are taught to put God first in all things, because that is wisdom, to put him first. We see it in the prophets, where Malachi says, you should trust God in this. You should partner with him in this mission, because this is wisdom. We have a pattern of wisdom being passed on through patriarchs, through precepts, through prophets, and then we arrive to the New Testament. Was it passed on through Jesus? Can we search for the tithe in the New Testament? Can it be found? When you turn the page to the New Testament, you will discover that the word tithe only appears in 2 places. It appears twice in the Gospels, but it's the same account. And it appears once in the book of Hebrews. And it appears in Hebrews just because the writer of Hebrews is trying to say, look, Abram's tithe was actually to Jesus. He's trying to show that Jesus is the better high priest. He's not really making a commentary on whether you should tithe or not. He's trying to make a commentary on who Jesus is. So let's go back to the gospel, because that's then the only other place that we have the word tithe. Jesus said to the Pharisees, you do well to tithe. It's a good thing that you do. Of course, he's pointing out all their hypocrisy when he does it. Matthew 23:23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. So the Pharisees who were living under the law are told, you do well, but you really don't do what's important. You don't show mercy or do justly. You're not walking humbly with your God. Now, as we go on in the Gospels, we'll find Jesus makes other commentaries about how much you should give. So he might have commended the Pharisees on 10%, but when the rich young ruler comes to him, he says, I've obeyed all the laws. What else must I do to follow you? And Jesus says, give 100%. That's what he says. Give it all away and come and follow me. Of course, he leaves sad. He doesn't want to do that. How about Zacchaeus? When Zacchaeus encounters Jesus and he's transformed, he says, come to my house. He says, I am committing to give 50% of all that I have away to the poor. And Jesus says, today salvation has come to your house. So what standard is it? Commending 10% to the Pharisees? You might like that a whole lot better. You might like life under the law a whole lot better than the 100% or the 50%. So did Jesus teach the tithe? No, he never taught the tithe. Matter of fact, he said, I give you a new commandment. I'm going to summarize all the law. I give you a new commandment, a law that will encompass all of the old. What is it? To love. He says, you're not under the Mosaic law, you're under Christ's law. John 13:34, Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. This is how the New Testament summarizes all of the law. It summarizes it into love, because a life of love fulfills the intent of the law. We say it again, a life of love fulfills the intent of the law. It will put God first because I love him with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and I love my neighbor as myself. 1 John 3:23, this is his commandment. This is the law, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he has commanded us. One way we love God is by giving, by putting him first in all of this. It was John Wesley when someone was challenging him about how much silver he might own. And he basically said, look, I've got one set of utensils. I shall not buy any more while so many around me want bread. This is what love leads us to do. Under the law of Christ, the love of Christ compels us to give for the very purposes of God, which is to love him and to love others. It's putting him first in all things. The New Testament is clear. We're not under law, but we're under grace. Romans 6:14 says it clearly. You are not under law, but under grace. And grace always compels us further than the law. I don't know if you've noticed that. But just Jesus, like he said, if you have 2 coats, give away one. 50% again. Grace, love will compel us to even do more than the law ever required of us. And there's this danger in trying to navigate my way down to percentages or exacting standards. That's just pulling the burden of the law right back onto myself. There's dangers in doing that. Larry Burkett, in his book, How to Manage Your Money, says, the first extreme is the danger of giving a strict 10% and viewing the remaining 90% as ours. The other extreme is using the lack of a standard, maybe the tithe, as an excuse to give almost nothing while we selfishly hoard the rest. It's like, I just want to be told what to do. Give me the standard. But we don't find that numerically in the New Testament. We don't find the tithe that way in the New Testament. But what we do find is proportional giving, which sounds very similar, does it not? A tithe is a portion, and Paul encourages us to give proportionally because we're seeing the wisdom of the patriarchs and the precepts of the law and the prophets. We're seeing it carried on, but in a new way where love compels us. 1 Corinthians 16:1-2, Paul tells the church in Corinth, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of the week, of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. Now, we can get bogged down into the reasons of why he was collecting money, but it was basically for ministry. It's basically to help out others. We discussed that in the Old Testament passages, ministry and distribution. And so what do we see here? We see Paul actually carrying on the same wisdom tradition that we saw threaded throughout the whole Old Testament. Not because of a law, but because of love. He says, I'm calling you to personally and proportionally and to regularly give. Personally, he says, each of you should give. Proportionally, he says, put aside as he may prosper. In other words, you know how much you have, how much God has prospered you. So put aside proportionally a part of that. And he says regularly on the first day of every week. So this kind of proportional, regular, personal giving is a lot like tithing. It's just not prescribing some particular percentage. But this is love compelled. This is not law compelled. The wisdom tradition, love compelled giving, carries on. And it even goes on after the apostles. Did the church continue in this kind of thing that Paul established? Absolutely. Think of 100 years after Christ, Justin Martyr. He says, and they who are well-to-do and willing give what each thinks fit, and what is collected is deposited with the president, maybe that's the elder chair, who, in a word, takes care of all who are in need. The tradition continued. You could go on to 200 AD and read the words of Tertullian. The tried men of our elders preside over us, obtaining that honor not by purchase, but by established character. There is no buying and selling of any sort in the things of God. Though we have our treasure chest, it is not made up of purchase money, as of a religion that has its price. And then he goes on to say how they use all these funds to minister to all the severe needs that are among them. And then he says, on the monthly day, if he likes, each puts in a small donation, but only if it be his pleasure, and only if he be able, for there is no compulsion. All is voluntary. These gifts are, as it were, piety's deposit fund. So we see that this is what the church was doing. This is what the early church had established as its standard. Yes, we give personally, proportionally, and regularly. And we do it with great joy because we recognize that I trust God in this and I'm partnering with God in this. So the teaching of the New Testament is that the law of love, the law of Christ now compels us to freely give personally, proportionally, and regularly. So now the last question of the morning, what should I do? I think it'd be good to carry on a wise tradition. I think that's a healthy thing. You know, all you parents here, you know what's best for your kids, right? You know the wisdom you want to see in them, and usually what you do is you codify that wisdom. You make house rules. Not because just for the sake of making rules, but you do them because you want your children to learn this wisdom and live in it, that eventually they would apply it on their very own. Not the rule, not the law, but the intent of what you were doing, that they would learn from it. So our parents, our patriarchs, are the patriarchs. Our parents are the precepts of the law. Our parents are the apostles and the prophets. And what did they tell us to do? Put God first in all things. Trust God. Partner with God. Do we do this? I found a Christianity Today article dating 1995. That's a long time ago. And this is what it said. People 45 years old and younger, so that'd be if you're 75 today, 75 years and younger, have grown up mesmerized by materialism. There's a tremendous pressure on families to spend, spend, spend. I've heard that the generation that believed in the tradition of tithing is in 3 places: retirement, nursing homes, and cemeteries. Would we carry on the tradition of giving well? Do we believe that Galatians 3:9, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, who eagerly gave to God? That we would be blessed along with him. Because the rejection of such wisdom to give personally and proportionally and regularly is not freedom. It's foolishness. Why would we reject the wisdom that we see carried on throughout these pages? We know that we tend towards spending as much as we make. And when you make more, your expenses just match your income. And you realize all the things that I've gathered, they must be stored somewhere, they must be repaired, they must be insured, so I need to save more money for myself so that I can take care of those things, and spending begets spending begets spending. Oh, that we could learn from this history of wise tradition. Oh, that we would learn from people like John Wesley, who practice exactly what I'm just saying, who in his first year of income, 1731, he determined, I will limit my expenses for the life. So his first year of when he was ever making money, he made 30 pounds. And he determined that he could live on 28. And he gave 2 pounds away. The next year, he says he doubled his income. And he doubted that he could limit himself to just 28 or 30 pounds. But he did. And he ended up giving 32 pounds away. Half. Over his life, his income rose to 1,400 pounds. But he consistently lived on 30 every year and gave the rest away. This was suspicious. Actually, he was investigated by the English tax commissioner. It's like, where is all this money? It's like, I give it away. And in his will, he wrote, my hands will be my executors. Meaning all that he left was the coins in his pocket. That was it. You may doubt you could pull off such a thing. You may doubt that you could do such a financial feat. But I want to challenge you this morning. Would you even be open to that? Some of you young people, would you be open to say, you know what? Whatever the standard of living is, whatever I'm spending now, would I just only increase that much every year? Would I give what I have that generously? That's hard. I get it. You feel that. Would the Spirit lead us in this? We sang that song. Would the Spirit lead us in all truth? John 16:13. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. And I trust that he will. Guys, I didn't do this. The very thing I just said, I'm guilty as well. It's not until a few years ago that I actually even started finding joy in giving. God had to do some work in my heart where I was like, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to give freely and joyfully. The truth is, the intent of the law is, the purpose of the tradition is, that this is a wisdom of revering God, of putting God first in all things. And wisdom is only true if it's applied in life. That's what wisdom is. It's truth applied in life. So would you receive this wisdom? Would the Spirit of wisdom lead you to place God first in all things? And would the Spirit of wisdom lead you to provide for God's work personally, proportionally, regularly? Because I do believe the same Spirit of God that inspired the law will always lead his followers to obey the intent of the law. The Spirit of God is not asking you to obey the laws of the Old Testament, but I guarantee you he's leading you to obey the intent of those laws. To put God first in all things, to love God above all, to love your neighbor as yourself. So how is your giving demonstrating that? Probably three kinds of givers. You might be the emotional tipper. After a sermon like this, oh, yeah, I should give. That was a good sermon. I'll give because Dan did a good sermon. The emotional tipper. It's just sort of a response in the moment. You might be a careful giver. You might really go over all of your expenses and you think, yeah, well, this is what I can do. And you're really careful in what you're thinking you can give. Would we grow to be generous investors? This wouldn't be based on emotion. It wouldn't be all based on my going analytically through all of my budget, but that I could be generous, investing in God's kingdom. Whichever of these you are, I want you to know this morning, and this is I'm closing with, this is more about your heart than it is about your money. The heart comes before money. God doesn't need your money, but he wants your heart. He wants your life. He wants you. This is exactly what Paul said to the church in Corinth, the same church that he told, give personally, proportionally, and regularly. He says, I'm going to come to you, and yeah, I've got some needs. But he says in 2 Corinthians 12:14, I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, but you. I feel the same. And preaching on giving and tithing money, what I want is you. I want your hearts just given to God, putting him first in all things. So as we talk about the details, law and grace and tithes and free will offerings and above and beyond and how much should I give and all those questions, we can get bogged so far down in analyzing all this. What I want you to do is just pray, be Spirit-led, trust the Lord, let him change your heart, and be generous. Be generous people. May it never be said of this church, you honor me with your tithe, but your heart is far from me. It's not what we want. Let me pray. Spirit, lead us. Lead us, Lord. I want to show up at your door and say, here's the fish. Here it is, giving to you first. Lord, lead us as we consider our own giving. We examine our own hearts. Lord, and cause us to be those who eagerly want to fulfill the intent of the law. Putting you first, loving you above all, loving our neighbor as ourselves. Lord, guide us, give us joy in giving, that we would be a deeply generous people. I pray this in your name. Amen.